All right, Kyle, the school year is approaching and you're like, John, it's only August. And we said this, I think in every year, the last few years of teaching is that August feels like the longest Sunday night of all time. Like August hits
Or
and
July for our southern state
some of
friends, right?
yeah, some of them are like back to school. Like I remember our Katy friends from down in Texas. We just talked with Seth from Katy a few weeks ago, and they're
Mhm.
they're probably back at the time of this recording. They're kind of entering classrooms and getting their doing their kind of district kickoff days. So, you're starting up in August, and we thought, hey, let's talk again about what the first week looks like. What are the activities? What are the things we're really focused on? And I wanted to toss this at you and to see if there's any changes you thought over the years. We've talked about the first week, the first kicking off the school year repeatedly. I think every year since we started the podcast, it's an important time to kind of set the stage. So I wanted to get your take on like if we think about the areas of our tree, our math classroom tree and strengthening that up. We've talked about that here for a year now on the podcast, for a year and a half, specifically on strengthening a classroom tree. What do you think, like going into the school year, Kyle, what would you say is, I know what I would say, but what did you would you say is like the most important piece of the tree to focus
Mhm.
on and be like, let's not mess this up. Let's make sure we do this one, strengthen this one up this year. What would be the tree piece you're going to focus on?
Yeah, well, I want to say that I think what I used to do was I used to focus in on the leaves, right? The
Right.
resources,
Sure.
what am I going, what content or, what amazing sort of lesson uh content am I going to create or find or, redo or whatever it is, but actually I'm going to leave the leaves out because I'm going to say there's so much time that goes into the leaves. It's fun, it's engaging, but it's a rabbit hole. And what I'm going to say, I want to talk about two parts of the tree. One is, I think pedagogy, we all look at, we all focus on it. And I would say we might even, hyper focus on it. So I want to
Mm-hmm.
gloss
Mm-hmm.
on what's important about the branches of the tree or our pedagogical moves and less about kind of revamping everything you're doing from a pedagogy perspective. I want you to think about whatever leaves I have, whatever resources I have currently. How do I take that and simply ensure that I'm asking kids to do some thinking before I do some telling?
Hmm.
Asking some questions before I make some statements, right? So again, it's that rush to the algorithm part. That is such an important piece. It's so much more important than the actual lesson itself than actually asking kids to think about something and getting their feedback, right? So if I
Right.
can ask them a question, it's like diagnostic, data city going on there, right? You ask them to do something and see what they come up with, and that's going to guide you as to where you go from there. It's like a leaping off point, right? When we do
Mm-hmm.
mentorship calls with teachers and district leaders, we use the same approach. Like it just makes perfect sense. We ask questions to figure out what is on their mind now. What do they know? What are they bringing with them? And where should we take off from here? Instead of me saying a bunch of things, randomly guessing what's important when it may or may not be important to them. The same thing's going on in our classrooms with our students. So the
Mm-hmm.
branches, I don't
Mm-hmm.
want you to spend a ton of time on the branches, but I just want you thinking about like if I can just ask more questions up front and hold off on the telling, hold off on the the action steps for kids and really let them do some thinking, that's going to be a game changer. And then I want to move right down to the roots
For
because
sure.
the roots of our tree is all about content area, right? It's all about
Mm-hmm.
content knowledge. And really, I can't ask a good question
Right.
if I'm not focusing in or honing in on the roots of the tree, right? Like I want the question to tell me something about what they know about that content area. And then how do I help take from, I don't know, I'll use the analogy here and say one route that they have, and how do we strengthen those roots for those students? Where do we go next so that they have a better foundational understanding of what's going on here? And that all comes down to content
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. It all comes down to conceptual understanding. And I'm telling you, if we focus on those two areas, you're going to see a huge amount of improvement, much more so than just finding the next coolest lesson to fire in on day one, week one, month one, or semester one of your school year.
Yeah, I agree. I'm gonna share a different part of the tree as a focus, and I think that would come as a surprise once I kind of outline that part of the tree. But when I think about the roots, well, like if I had to pick between those two, like you were saying, you started with pedagogy, which is the branches of your tree. They support the leaves. Like we're gonna go back a couple steps here. Like let's go back and look at the branches of the tree. And I think people, and this is what you said, is that a lot of times the focus is on the pedagogical moves, but in order for you to be strong on the pedagogical moves, you do have to have that solid foundation. So I would say, like, if you had to pick one this year, like one area of the tree to really focus on, and I'm just really thinking about the two that you just highlighted, Kyle. I'm gonna push back on you here a little bit, is to say, like, you really should focus on the roots. Like you should go like, this is the year that I'm going to make sure that I have an answer to
Mhm.
why the keep change flip on dividing fractions works. Like I'm going to have that answer. Like I'm going to make sure I know why. And I'm going to also be able to demonstrate, model, talk about strategies around that. And that's just one thing. Like that's one math epiphany that you're going to want to make sure you can bring to students, this year. And I don't care what grade level you are. Like if you're you're teaching grade 2, grade 3, grade 7, grade 8, grade 9, grade 12, and still don't know why the keep change flip works, go
Mm.
figure that out. Like make that your to-do list. Like that would be the thing I would say. If you're going to make one change this year in the work that you're going to be putting in all year long, is go, what are the math epiphanies that I need answers to so that I can be confident in the classroom? Because when you're confident in the classroom around the roots of what you're teaching,
Mm.
all of those pedagogical moves, the branches of the tree just get stronger automatically.
I
Like
love it.
they get stronger automatically just because you're confident in the work and in where the thoughts in the strategies around those roots.
I love it. I love it. Something that, you're reminding me of is this. I think I'll call it a bit of a trap. I'm not saying it's not bad. It's not bad, but I think we can do it better. Is the idea that, like, we always talk about day one, like we do math on day one. Like we don't just like do the syllabus on day one. I used to do the syllabus on day one, right? And I used to do the rules and everything. And
Mhm.
I'm going to get this class in gear here and so forth. And of course, in the younger grades, maybe it doesn't look exactly like that. But coming from the high school classroom, it certainly did for a long time. We have a lot of people now that are going, well, I'll do some math in week 1 too, but I'm just going to focus on these other, we'll call them like the process expectations,
Right.
as we call them here in Ontario, or the math practices. And we're not going to really hone in on the actual content itself. Like we're not going to dig in to, like, the standards, the expectations of the course. And we would argue it's like, we want the process expectations, we want the practices happening all the time.
Right.
And I don't want kids to see them as separate from
Yeah.
learning content. Like we want the content to be the reason that they're able to engage in these practices and these process expectations. So I like to think about the mathematical proficiencies, for example. We talked about, understanding the actual conceptual understanding, right? And the roots really help us with that. But you have like adaptive reasoning and strategic competence and, productive disposition, right? Like you have all the 5 math proficiencies there. We should be looking at those to frame all of the content we're exploring all year long. So why hold back on curricular tasks, as many people would call them, versus, say, doing non-curricular tasks? Now, again, it's not bad to do non-curricular tasks. I just worry that it's hard for us to go from a non-curricular task and do certain processes and certain practices. And then we start to go, okay, now the content's coming in. What I often see is people then shift into a different mode of instruction. And it's like, now that we're into the content, well, I've got to teach it a different way. Like it's got to happen a different way. So from day one, if you have a good task, it's a good task. So
Right.
how do I just pick good
Yeah.
tasks that are related to either content you're going to explore that year, or it's great content that is worth re-exploring? Because let's be honest, when's the last time an entire class of kids came to you and they had everything with them from the previous year? You're like, yep, they got it all. They've got it all. They
Check.
came to me. They knew
Totally.
Yeah, they knew all the stuff, right? I used to think
Nobody
that's
ever
what's
said, I
supposed to
don't
happen.
remember that. No
I've
one
never
taught me
met an
that. Nobody
educator
taught me
who,
that.
no, never met an educator that was like, wow, my class came in and it was like, we are ready to go from day one. And they're like, they're ready to start, knocking off these expectations. No, what we want to do is we want to, instead of going, say, non-curricular, is that we actually want to take content that maybe they have some familiarity with, not
Right.
necessarily, strength in because summer's long or they never got it the first time. We want to use that content as a means to determine where are they at, and like, how do I inch along this trajectory, this journey
Mm-hmm.
towards deeper content over time, so that I am doing curricular content all the time.
Love it.
Because the reality is you need these, foundational ideas to be built upon in order to get to the stuff that you're supposed to cover anyway.
Yeah.
So that time is of the essence. We don't have time to, quote unquote, do non-curricular tasks, and then leave content for later in week 2 or whatever it is. Dig in,
Yeah.
show kids that math is fun, show them that they can problem solve, and show them that, hey, they probably know more than they realize or recognize from prior years.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think your key statement there is that showing students that the math practices or the math process standards are not separate from learning content. They go hand in hand, and they're really the content ends up being the vehicle for us to actually get at those practices. And I think when we do non-curricular, like you're saying, we separate those ideas in a way. Like for example, you can choose tasks that allow you to get to content that also achieve the same things that you were trying to get at using your non-curricular tasks. Like for example, I would I would change, and I do change what I do in the first week. Like I used to use the skyscrapers,
Mm.
activity where it's like the puzzle where everyone's, building the skyscrapers. They're trying to create, the 4, 3, 2, 1, cross this way, cross this way. We do it in groups. We did that to build, this idea of productive struggle and like resiliency, and trying to go like, what does it mean to like stick with problems? Because sometimes they get tough. And we built like our continuum of what does it look like when I give up on tough problems, and what does it look like when I struggle through problems. That was an important part because that kind of goes into, my piece and what I think is the most important part of the tree. And I'll share that in a minute. But I used to do skyscrapers. I don't think I'm going to I wouldn't do skyscrapers anymore because it is a non, like there is no curricular expectation or curricular standard attached to that particular thing other than the process standards or the math practices. So I would rather do split 25, which we've
Mm.
talked about on podcasts before around what do we do on the first week of classes, because split 25 gets at the exact same, lesson, non-curricular, that I want to get to. But at the same time, we get to talk about what is an exponent, and how do we relate exponents? How do we write exponents? What are the pieces of an exponent in a power? What does it mean about repeated multiplication? Because that activity is fundamental in getting to that moment. And like we achieve both things, and we get to talk about curricular ideas at the exact same time. So choosing activities like that over top of, say, non-curricular. So I agree there. Now let's get to my pick for the piece of the tree that I think is fundamental in week 1, which is the trunk of the tree. The trunk of the tree in our classroom is like our pillars. This is like our culture. This is like setting the stage so that we are bringing our, we're creating the classroom that we want to be seeing. And that is that trunk. Like everything springs from there. So we talk about acceptance. We talk about seeing ourselves as a mathematician, and we see ourselves as our identities in math class. We talk about, making sure that we create this culture that we're looking for. And then when I do this, like what I do on week 1 is, and we've talked about this before on previous first year, getting ready for the year podcast episodes, and we're going to put those in the show note links, is we talk about the pillars of math class. Like, what are the things that really matter here in this room with this group of students around learning mathematics? And then everything builds from there. Like all the rules come out from the pillars of math. All the decisions around why we're doing this lesson over this lesson comes from the pillars. Why our assessment strategies do this comes from the pillars. It's kind of like they become the philosophical ideas of every decision that gets made in math class. And for me, for a long time, the pillars were 4 different pillars. And you could create the pillars yourself. You can create them with students. Get them to say, what do you want? Like put your magic wand wish list out here. Get your magic wand and say, hey, students, what does a math class look like to you where you learn in an optimal way? And together you can co-create the pillars. And usually what I steer students to, and I steer them towards these pillars, Kyle, because we want these things to come out in values. I steer them to 4 things: growth, curiosity, collaboration, and struggle. And it's like, when we talk about those pillars, we say, hey, we are going to focus on growth here, and I'm concerned about growth. And that's how everything we do is about how you grow along this trajectory of this continuum around the math practices and the math standards. So we are going to reward your growth, and that reflects in our assessment policies. That reflects in how how we're going to keep track of how you're doing on those standards. We talked about different ways to assess. We've got our growth days in past. We've got our whole course that we help teachers right now with on assessment for growth, and that came out of that pillar that you and I spent years trying to figure out. How do we help kids understand assessment for growth and reward their growth? So that is a huge pillar for us because it helps decide on how things will look in the classroom, and students start to go, oh, I believe that growth really matters, and not just say getting a mark on a report card. Curiosity is the foundation for everything that we're learning here. And we're always going to put students in curious moments because we believe that being curious opens our minds to accepting new learning. And that's a really important thing in our classroom. So we're going to put you in, different situations so you're curious, and curiosity is a huge thing. And so when students say like, why are we doing this type of lesson? We're like, because remember, curiosity is really important for our learning. And we want you to be as curious as possible. So we want you to ask questions, and I'm going to ask you questions, and I'm going to be curious, and one of the first things we do in that first week is I want to be curious about you, and then that's like, let's talk about the math is like activity. We'll put a link to that math is like activity, in the show notes, as well as like getting you to, express how you felt in the past about, your experience with mathematics. Sarah Vanderwerf's, used name tense to get at how do I be curious about the students that are in my room? Like, we have to create a culture of curiosity, and it doesn't mean students are just curious. Teachers are curious as well. And we have to demonstrate that, along that first week all year. And these pillars represent all year. Collaboration, that's the third pillar, is how do we, we're always going to be asking students to work with each other, because sharing ideas is an important part of math learning and communicating ideas and being accepting of different ideas. So why do we do random grouping? Why do was every time you get a card and you go and sit down at different spots in the room? Because we have to get to know each other, and we have to collaborate with each other and feel safe in our environment. That's a really important part of the learning that we're going to do here in this classroom. And the last part is struggle. Thinking about putting you in situations where you don't know how to solve the problem. And we're going to help you solve that problem. And you're going to learn through problem solving and through struggle, instead of just being told how to solve problems. Because one of the fundamental pieces of that pillar is like, we believe we can do hard things. You can do hard things. We can do hard things. And we're going to help you do hard things. And that's a really important pillar in our math class. But like, those are the 4 pillars we've used, but it doesn't mean those are the 4 pillars you're going to use. But I would say, if you're going to kick off the school year and one of those areas is the most important, focus on the trunk in that first week, and then follow the trunk all year long. It's like, create your pillars, and then make sure that you're valuing and showing students that you value the things that are those pillars in the trunk of the tree. So just a quick recap here, Kyle. I said the trunk, you said the roots and the branches. Anything to add before we sign off here for today?
Well, I think that's a good overview, because as you're talking, I'm going, yes, like I'm nodding my head. I love the ideas that you're sharing here, John. And I'm reflecting back to some of the ideas I had shared as well. And I'm just picturing, we have all kinds of educators. We have district leaders listening. We have brand new teachers listening, and everyone in between. And what we want to let you know is that it is just like with our students. It is a process. It's a growth process. So you have to understand that you can't put all of these things in place in a day, right? So you've got to start somewhere. The best thing you could possibly do is to start doing some of this learning yourself, right? So we're talking about the tree, but maybe you want to dig in and just better understand what we are really talking about when we look at these 6 parts of an effective math classroom. And for our district leaders, the 6 parts of an effective math program, by heading over to makemathmoments.com/report. And it will ask you, are you in the classroom or are you a district leader? And it will send you down a little, kind of an assessment, essentially. It's a screener to kind of give you some ideas, and it will send you a report. Now, it's not only going to highlight the area of the tree that you might want to focus on now, but you can actually explore the report deeper, and you can actually learn about all 6 areas of the tree. So that might be a great first step for you if you have not yet done so, because if you don't really know what that tree looks like and what it will take to grow and strengthen those different parts of the tree, that could be very overwhelming. And we're at the beginning of a school year, and that can be overwhelming just in and of itself, right? So give yourself grace. Understand that this isn't something that happens overnight. The reason we picked a tree for this analogy is because trees grow slow and steady, and we just continue to try to work on those different areas for the rest of our careers, right? That's the key piece here. You are not going to, by the end of year 1 or the end of the first year that you start focusing on different areas of the tree, you cannot expect that that tree will be fully grown, right? So keep that in mind. And remember, you need to give yourself grace, continue the journey. And just by continuing the learning and giving yourself that grace, you will strengthen those areas. And you're going to look back down the road sometime, somewhere, and you're going to see that, wow, that time, effort, and just focus has allowed you to become the best version of yourself in that math classroom or in that district leader role. So again, head over, makemathmoments.com/report, and take a few minutes to strengthen your tree.
Also, folks, we put out 3 episodes in the past around starting the school year off. Number 36 was how to start the school year off right. Number 88 was starting the school year off right from a distance. That was after the COVID years. And also number 139, which was making math moments starting from day 1 to day 180. We'll put all of those in the show notes so that you can go back and maybe binge listen over the next little bit before you are showing up in the classroom with students.
Ratings and reviews, friends, are super helpful, and sharing the podcast in the same way that you found the podcast is also extremely helpful, so we can reach more folks just like you. Well, until next time there, John, I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr.
High fives for us.
And a high five for you.